Please, Philip.
Good morning. Does my sound good?
Yeah.
Oh,
good.
Perfect. Okay. And can you see my screen?
Yeah, but please open it completely.
It's coming. All right, dear colleagues, good morning. Thank you, Horacio, for the introduction. Actually, I don't have a very specific aim today. I'll just like to share with you some miscellaneous observations on Pontic and what looks like particularly Sinopean Amphora in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I'm very pleased to be presenting here at the PATABS IV conference. So as has becoming clearer and clearer, and especially through this conference, as we heard yesterday and also today, Eastern Mediterranean perspective, the role of Pontic, like mostly Sinopean Amphoras, the Eastern Mediterranean, seems to have been quite substantial, really in the Middle and Late Roman period. This is largely thanks to the work on the production side by Kassab Tezgör, but also on the consumption side by colleagues like Dominique Perry and Paul Reynolds, who worked in the Levant. So from the consumption side, two places where I am involved in the study of the material. The first is Limira in Lisha, an Austrian excavation project, where throughout a large number of contexts, there was always one or a couple of fragments of, again, mostly Sinopean carat amphoras of C, II, and III that showed up. But I was particularly struck by what is characterized as a late Roman village in northern Israel, northern Israel, mostly 5th to early 7th centuries occupation. This is a bit of an older picture of after a bushfire. But what really struck me here is that although the overall percentage of imports is very, very low. I mean, this was a village that relied on regional trade or exchange of pottery, agricultural produce. But amongst that very low percentage of imports, it was these breeds that stand out. I mean, that's the most common imported amphora, which of course begs the question: what kinds of exchange systems are we dealing with if even a small village like this received Sinopean amphoras? I mean, they traveled really. So as one of the first observations, both based on fieldwork and literary bibliographical study, these are find spots of Pontic C2 and C3 amphoras. Looks like mostly C3, and again, it looks like Sinop amphora played a major role here. And I think today, Ephesus and also yesterday about the shipwrecks, could very well confirm that. So these are just dots on the map. For these periods, or for this kind of amphora, there's very little quantitative data that we can actually use to start understanding the role of these amphoras, although what Horacio presented this morning about Ephesus could be very, very interesting. It is very, very interesting. To show that not all of these were Sinopean or look like Sinopean, but this is probably it's a carat type amphora, but not Sinopean. Looks like Heraclea production to me, and actually very similar to one we saw this morning from Ephesus. And again, dots on the map for the let's say later 5th to early 7th century D series. Again, mostly Sinopean, it seems. Mostly D1 and 2. D3 seems to be quite rare. We know of a couple of examples in the northern Levant. But again, what we can see here is that these amphoras, in comparison to the series, much further inland, including, excuse me, including this late Roman village in Galilee. For these amphoras, we have a little bit more quantitative data. Places like Zeugma, Beirut, suggest that they were fairly common in 6th century patterns. And here are some what looks like Sinopean amphoras of different types, some C series mostly. So the type C, I, II, and III, it appears, from excavations at Caesarea Maritima in Israel. Excuse me. These are mostly from the Arab context, Abbasid and later. But I mean, they are fairly consistently showing up. And here's another example from Tanagra in Boeotia. Again, it looks like Sinopean, based on the size of the fragment and the diameter of the neck. It will be a C1 or C2, probably C1, really. And again, to underline the point that Sinop seems to have been, let's say, the major player in this field. Again, from Tanagra, there are 2 fragments, handle fragments of 2 different vessels from, again, possibly Heraclea production, type 4C, and I think Sergei for helping this identification. So, again, some other finds, really these unbelievably big amphoras, and I'm most grateful to my colleague Banu Jena-Marksteiner for allowing me to show them here. These are dates 83, 89 amphoras, partly preserved, unfortunately, and from a context that is not entirely clear, from the Theatertermen in Limera, again in Lisha, and we lovingly call these the big brothers or big sisters, if you will. We know of at least one production center in Pontic. It's not very clear if these are actually that fabric, and again, looking at the microscope pictures, it might be that there are 2 different fabrics, and of course, the one on the right, you can actually see very nicely how it looks like different clays were mixed to produce these. These seems to be very rare in the Eastern Mediterranean. I know of one other example in Pergamon, but yeah, they are very interesting. Again, a top of an amphora from late 4th century context from Sagalas, which I would think is from the southern Pontic. Initially, I thought, well, this is very much like Sinopean Pat Claire, but again, let's say reevaluating, maybe it's safer to think of the southern Pontic origin. And again, it's not very clear to see, unfortunately, but we have some sort of red paint. It looks like on the handle. We know from let's say real Sinopean amphoras, which is quite an interesting feature. And again, in thinking in terms of paint, but also of change of ideas, this amphora, which was found also at Caesarea in around 8400. To me, this resembles Sinopean type amphora. And when we look at the fabric description, sandy, very micaceous, silver and gold. To me, at least, this doesn't sound like, but it could be another Pontic type of an amphora. When I collected the evidence for the distribution of Pontic Sinopean amphoras of the 4th century, one of the problems I ran into also in the field is the similarity with late Roman one, or at least certain fabrics of late Roman one, and especially very small fragments of handles and body shirts. I wasn't always very sure that I could identify them, and really left it open. And this point is, of course, emphasized by the recent monograph showing clearly late Roman style amphoras that are related to manufactured Sinope or in the region of Sinope. And again, also Obites, recent article showing something similar. It's possible that this one, again from Sagalos, from a late Roman context, could be Pontic. It clearly has volcanic inclusions, although the microscope photograph doesn't show this. It's a very light clay. The handle is really scattered with black volcanic inclusions. And to come back to the point about, let's say, the fusion of shapes and fabrics, I got confused when this fragment, which I originally classified as a Pontic-style parrot amphora, its fabric to me is much closer to late Roman one, or at least one particular kind of fabric of late Roman one. So that really got me a little bit confused. And of course, this somehow ties in with the original idea that Seleucia Pieria in close to Antakya was a production center of parrot amphoras. But this idea has largely dismissed. And I think I would agree with that. Seleucia probably much more as a major hub for redistribution in the Eastern Mediterranean. So it seems that in terms of identification, it seems that these Sinopean amphoras, and this applies to the parrot type as well, so that it seems to be a fairly consistent picture, which is largely due to the technological and other research. But when we look at morphology and in general, the kind of ribbing color mostly, because we know of some redder variants, but also the inclusions and temperament of red. Inti, again, here this line in red on the handle. I think it's like that mostly what was circulating in the Eastern Mediterranean are in fact Sinopean amphoras. Fabric, I mean, this is just macroscopic qualities, and I mean, analysis are in progress, let's say, but again, we see a fairly consistent picture of relatively clean matrix, variable quantities of pyroxenes, and the occasional fragment. It's difficult of this green glassy inclusion, which might be olivine. Dominique originally already suggested. When we go back to the distribution of these C series and D series, and what looks like mostly Sinopean amphoras, there are a couple of interesting observations, are hypothetical, based on what I've literature mostly, is that they didn't really seem to be traveling to what is now Greece. So they may have been just bypassing Greece, mostly find them here and there. It's very small numbers, but it was really the Levant, Turkey, that they were heading for. I mean, the ships traveling these. What I find interesting, which I already knew, is that these series seem to be traveled much further inland, even all the way along the Euphrates to Nubia or Halabia. And I mean, the very little quantitative data we have is that these series were distributed a little bit more commonly in terms of quantity. Which, as I mentioned, also makes us think about the circulation and consumption. I mean, Dominique and also Dominique, they have already had a partly military function, so the Annona, but at a small village in northern Israel, as I've shown in the beginning, this was probably more commercial redistribution on a regional level. Anyway, this hypothetical idea about distribution and intensity of distribution in these series also made me think, so what was happening before, let's say, the 4th century AD? And so it brought me to the B series. And to be very frank with you, I've never seen them, which could just be me, of course. And of course, very interesting that we've seen an example from Ephesus this morning, and also yesterday from Lyon. And what was extremely helpful, Diana Dobreva's article from 2018, showing the distribution of these B series. Again, they are mostly associated with silver. So I've learned not exclusive. And they show up quite often in Italy, which is interesting. We know of a couple in Crete, Gortyn, Beirut, well, Ephesus, it seems. We can add 2 more dots, Gortyn and Caesarea, where there are probably this base, but certainly these kinds of, or these 2 tops, described as sparkling inclusions, will be black volcanic bits, combination of fabric sound right, I would say. And again, with these miscellaneous observations, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much.